Tonight, we are looking at in a series of building resilient supply chains, addressing the issue of modern slavery. I just wanted to just add to what has already been said about who I am, what we do. I run Unchained Solutions. We're here to inspire Australian organisations to be leaders in making impact on modern slavery. Three key words: inspire, lead, and impact. Our whole company is to help organizations, largely corporates and small business, to address a compliance piece. But we see opportunities to inspire you to be leaders in this space. There's plenty of opportunities for that, and to make a real impact across the supply chain of your business. And our vision is to see the piece of legislation implemented in every boardroom so that business leaders can make a positive social impact, because it's a great reporting mechanism. Part of our profits go to ending modern slavery through funding the Freedom Business Alliance, who work with survivors of modern slavery through vocational training and meaningful employment. And that is our main touch point in terms of supporting those who are at work at the grassroots as we face the corporate landscape. The Unchained our value is really a blend of a lived experience of many on our team who have actually worked in different contexts, including myself and our co-director, who's also my wife, Sarah. We spent 5 years working in Spain with survivors of modern slavery and setting up a project there. And we've combined that with expertise and tools of supply chain professionals and those who specialize in strategy and policy to come up and develop a range of products and services to actually support organizations as they achieve various elements of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We have a turnkey solution comprising 5 areas: strategy, analysis, training, documents, and research. And our solution in a sense, is completely adaptable to any level of maturity that an organization may have with the legislation. If you're just beginning, you have no idea what you're doing, all the way through to the most advanced organizations who are obviously at times listed, we can actually provide services to help you on your journey to compliance and beyond. We're also industry agnostic, and we've worked with in a range of sectors, including mining, education, agriculture, finance, construction, health, logistics, retail, and not-for-profits, and that's ever expanding. We delight in actually meeting and working with companies from different sectors. That expands the breadth and scope of and the maturity of our own services and what we're actually providing to our clients. So today I want to outline a few things. One, firstly, the risk of modern slavery. What does it mean and what does it look like? Then to look at the impact of the Modern Slavery Act, both at a Commonwealth and New South Wales state level on the corporate landscape, and then provide some key steps for industry professionals and what you can actually do today and ways that we might be able to support you from here on. So just quickly then, the risk of modern slavery. It was back in May 2022 that the oil tanker AG Neptune was arrested off the coast of Newcastle, the port of Newcastle in New South Wales, after it had been discovered that two things. One, that there was contamination with the fuel on the ship, which was a major environmental concern. The second was that upon the discovery of the contamination, that 21 seamen were found on board to be at risk and had been experiencing degrees of exploitation around the realm of human rights, extreme forms of human rights violations. This included being owed collectively over $120,000 in income. It also included looking at the food and the water provisions that were provided and medical services that were provided. They were way below maritime standards, and these 21 men were deemed to be severely exploited. I raise this topic because this issue related to one of my clients, not that they were directly involved, but the ship that had the fuel was owned by one of their key energy suppliers, Aviva Energy. The ship is Liberian owned. The charter company managing the ship, Vital, is based in the UK, and the ship was fueled in Taiwan. That may or may not be much to you, but upon being given the brief from our client as to what actually happened here, it was a very fascinating exploration into the human rights and modern slavery due diligence of key entities such as Viva Energy and Vital and our client, who all have policies in place and procedures and all sorts of mechanisms to verify risks and mitigate the risks of human rights violations on top of environmental. And for some reason, inconclusively, it's been very difficult to determine how it is, on the one hand, that the environmental, the fuel contamination happened in the first place, and second of all, how it is that 21 men were actually experienced human rights violations upon this ship. Nevertheless, the outcome of this scenario was that the ship was banned from Australian waters for 6 months. And it really points to some of the dynamics involved in identifying and addressing human rights violations, that even the most vigilant risk management and governance frameworks, policies, procedures, auditing structures, and signing up to all manner of international treaties and agreements can, in a sense, that there can be instances of modern slavery and human rights violations. And so it really points to the need for increased modern slavery due diligence and attention to actually what's going on throughout our supply chains, and really points to the complexity of the issue of what we're discussing today. Modern slavery, according to the Unseen UK, is the commodification of people for the purpose of exploitation and financial gain. So what we're thinking about here when it comes to the issue of modern slavery is something that's really to do with the economy, our global economy, and how many people in our world are treated for the purpose and the convenience and luxury of others. And that's part of the global dynamic in which in terms of the economy in which we operate in our world today, sadly. At a United Nations human rights level, modern slavery could be defined very simply at an acute level as the lack of choice, movement, and voice. So people's movement and opportunities are severely restricted or limited. Their opportunities to choose the path of life freely and to speak out about their situation can be severely restricted. It's also a term that's being used by governments both here in Australia and also in the United Kingdom to in a sense, as an umbrella term to describe a number of human rights violations of a similar kind, such as forced labor, forced servitude, debt bondage, child labor, forced marriage, and human trafficking. And these dynamics are, in a sense, combined under the umbrella term because they don't operate in isolation necessarily. A person, for example, who is trafficked across a border may have started the journey in debt bondage, that they needed to borrow some money in order to service that loan. They needed to then submit themselves to somebody who then trafficked them into another jurisdiction and then put them in forced labor, for example, as a scenario of how that might work. It's very difficult to determine what is a case of modern slavery, but we can, in a sense, look at the different indicators that are there. So we can consider such indicators as low or no pay, excessive work hours or days without rest. There may be a recruitment fee into the thousands of dollars. Lack of a proper contract, people might be on a series of short contracts, which also minimizes the opportunity to speak out and to have a voice and to advocate. Loss of identity through the confiscation of papers and passports, for example, identity papers. Fines for all sorts of indiscretions. Unsafe workplaces, for example, unsafe factory floor or the water or the air or the machinery. It's often the case that this is where modern slavery risk dovetails with environmental concerns, that where there is say an unsafe factory with a poor waste management system, this can also point to maybe some of the conditions that are actually at work in that factory. And then there's also sorts of psychological and abuse issues around coercion, threats, and intimidation. And this is a way in which people are controlled in a modern slavery context. Now, you might be looking at this list and thinking, well, you should come to my workplace because, well, we all work long hours where I work. But you also might think, well, yes, but you can also go home and you've got your passport and you're getting paid at least a living wage, or according to a wage that the Fair Work Ombudsman is approving of. Really, it's a case here of the greater the cluster of indicators, the greater the risk, the greater that we can say, well, this is the case. This is a human rights violation of a grave formation, and we need to investigate this further. In terms of the scope, the latest figures from the International Labour Organization put the number of cases at around 50 million plus. This is up some 10 years ago from about 40 million. So the numbers are increasing, and these kind of numbers, these big numbers, if you like, probably point more to the fact that there's more data that's being collected. There are more and more people in the world, and there are more and more people being exploited, but there's also a lot more information that's actually being gathered to help us to understand what this issue is. And so we don't really know how many people there are being exploited, but this is the latest figure put out by the ILO. What we can say is that of that number, that 1 in 4 are children, and that 73% are women and girls. And so this is an issue that really is a gender issue. This does impact those who are probably the most vulnerable in our society. Most of the issues are in the forced labor area. So we're looking at exploitation in factories, on farms, and on fishing boats. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And when it comes to what this looks like in Australia, some stats around that, there's probably approximately 15,000 cases in Australia, although I think that's a dated and conservative figure. What's more interesting, I think, in Australia is that only 1 in 5 cases are reported, which I think indicates to us, well, where's the other 4 cases, and what is it saying about how people report, or how this issue is reported. Unfortunately, I think in Australia, we do have a lot of anecdotal information. We do have some level of research, but it's not comprehensive enough in terms of what it looks like. This can lead many companies to think that the risk of modern slavery is low, and it may be low in comparison to other jurisdictions, parts of the world, particularly parts of East Asia, Southeast Asia, for example. But nevertheless, there are cases here in Australia, and they are serious by nature. You may be mindful of some of the more obvious industries. There's been a big spotlight that's been put on chocolate and cocoa production, tea production, big spotlight on fashion in particular since the collapse of the Rana Plaza back in 2013, when 1,100 women were killed in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And a big spotlight in these days around the treatment of men, young men in particular, in sort of the seas around Thailand. Who are trapped for months, if not years at times, on boats, on fishing boats, and then discarded once they become too weak and sick to actually service the industry. The spotlight has led to a lot of activity. There's been a lot of work being done, for example, by Thai Union to address this kind of violation off the coast of Thailand. A lot of work continues to be done in the fashion industry. It's a very complex and long supply chain, and there are many touch points for the fashion industry. And there is still also a lot of work that's been done with our chocolatiers. But again, there's a lot more work that needs to be done, particularly at the big corporate level, to collaborate and to actually come up with a more comprehensive program to help and address this issue at the grassroots. Really, what we can say that we could probably safely say that for most products in the world, there is probably some touch point in terms of either the manufacturing of the product or the harvesting of the raw materials for those products. The risk of modern slavery runs through many industries, and you may be mindful in your industry what those are at the moment. But here is just a snapshot of what some of those industries will look like. And the spotlight is not necessarily so much on these because they're not high consumables in the market. A lot of these products we take for granted, and they're just embedded in our everyday life, and we just expect them to be there. But increasingly, there's more and more transparency and a lot more information that's coming out about areas of risk in all these sectors. For the context in Australia, the main areas are in construction, agriculture, cleaning, retail services, security, and the area of forced marriage, which is not necessarily in the transactional space, but it could be considered that way if there's payment for the bride made as well. So these areas, there's increasing spotlight on how modern slavery has evolved in Australia. And even if we consider modern slavery to be on a continuum, on a spectrum, from a high level, people experiencing issues of wage theft, people, for example, working in the harvesting season on farms, for example, might be at risk of modern slavery, but they may also just be at risk of various forms of wage theft or some sort of substandard accommodation or mistreatment or overwork in those contexts. So not everything is modern slavery. Modern slavery does sit at the sort of extreme form, but it can be a slippery slope into extreme forms of modern slavery risk. According to Louis Sidabaca, who was a former ambassador against human trafficking in the United States at large, says it's not a question of if, but where and to what extent there is slavery in your supply chains and operations. And so what we do find is those organizations that do start scratching, they do start finding. And really the appetite for change really comes as companies do start scratching. And this is in a sense, an example of good practice, not to rest on the idea that perhaps there's just low risk in our supply chain, but actually going out of your way to do the due diligence. And due diligence does require a certain level of investment, a certain level of scratching to make sure that the risk of modern slavery is not in the supplying goods of in the supply of your goods and services. So what is in a sense happening at the government or at the policy level to address this issue? You may be aware of the Modern Slavery Act at the Commonwealth level, 2018. We also have a piece of legislation of a similar nature for the state of New South Wales. They were both enacted in 2018, except the New South Wales law then went into hiding to make sure that it didn't clash with the Commonwealth legislation. It's now in full play, and I'll explain a little bit about that in a moment. Let's just backtrack in terms of why is it that we've come to a place where we do have anti-slavery legislation. If we consider this where we are in Australia, we do have a criminal code, and slavery is actually a criminal offence in this country. So it does at times beg the question is, why do we need a separate piece of legislation? Well, this legislation is really targeting the kind of work that companies need to do, which in parts of the world which are largely out of their control. So while slavery is illegal in this country and illegal in many countries, the anti-slavery legislation is really designed to help companies to, in a sense, put out there and lay a foundation for them to identify risks in the supply of their goods and services, and to take reasonable steps to remediate, to make changes in their business structure and their business strategy to actually address this issue. Hard legislation is emerging throughout the world. It's already there in the UK, in France, Netherlands, in Germany, the European Union, the state of California, and it's emerging in places like New Zealand and Canada. So we are seeing a shift in what was there, soft laws in terms of the UN Sustainable Development Goals or the guiding principles in business and human rights. These are all being translated into more hard legislation, such as the Modern Slavery Act. If we were to think of if we were to summarize really what the Modern Slavery Act is about, and what I suppose a lot of reporting mechanisms are about, it's about three things. It's about transparency, it's about responsibility, and it's about effectiveness. So in a sense, what the government's asking companies to do and organizations to do is to be transparent and to overcome whatever reputational risks may be there in order to be transparent. So it's about identifying risks and taking steps to identify those risks, as well as being honest and open about what is going on in your supply chains, and to demonstrate that transparency through an annual report called a Modern Slavery Statement. The second piece around that, though, is once you've actually found what the risks are, that you actually take steps to be responsible, that you determine the level of responsibility in terms of your connection and your involvement to that particular case, if there's a case within your supply chain, and you determine what steps you need to take to be responsible. And thirdly, the third component of that then is around measuring effectiveness. There can be a lot of activity that we can do to try and address this issue, but one of the key components is really to measure how effective that is and whether or not what we're doing in terms of identification and responsibility is actually being effective in terms of the work that we're doing. And that helps us, in a sense, that guides our investment and resourcing in this space. The reporting criteria for the Commonwealth Act is divided into 7 mandatory sections. And as I've just described, in terms of the transparency or responsibility and effectiveness piece, is really summarised in points 3, 4, and 5. This is kind of the bulk crux, if you like, the centre of the reporting mechanism. However, it is also important that companies do report clearly in terms of who they are and their structure. And it's at times for some organisations that may be a challenge if they do have a complex business structure, that they need to declare who they are and how they're operating and where the risk of modern slavery may be impacting those parts of the business. There's the challenge of modern slavery is summarised by Nolan and Boersma to academics when they say modern slavery sits on a continuum of exploitation. It should not and cannot be addressed in isolation. In our bid to manage, reduce and eliminate modern slavery, we need first to acknowledge the larger contextual problems from which it emerges. We should treat the symptoms and the causes. And so really what Professor Nolan and Boersma are actually pointing to is that when it comes to addressing modern slavery, there are certain foundational steps that we need to take, and I'll articulate them in a moment. But we actually need to make sure that we're in our approach to this, that we're thinking long term, that we're setting long-term goals, and we're assigning a decent amount of resources and investment to address what is actually going on and understanding the context of the problem and the specifics of the issue. For an example of this is in terms of doing a risk assessment, it's one thing to map your suppliers, and at times that means mapping those who you buy directly from and trying to segment the risk according to low, medium, high. There is great value in that process, that direct supplier exercise of risk assessments, but that really, in a sense, is the beginning of the process. The data that is there for that is data that you've received, and it's the data that you're processing. What Boersma and Nolan are really calling for is actually a greater intentionality to take that initial assessment, take that initial data that's available, which is reliable. There's a certain degree of reliability, but in a sense, to get to the specifics, we need to get to the actual context. And that means pushing through deeper into the supply chain and taking reasonable steps to actually work out where the risks are. And that takes a greater degree of investment, of planning, of collaboration, and also collaborating with NGOs and government officials to actually get to the context in which modern slavery is occurring, to get to the factory level, to get to the mine, to get to where perhaps the farm level of where the actual exploitation may be occurring. And it's from there that you can actually determine what remediation is going to look like. The risks for not doing much or not doing enough can be clearly seen, and you may recall back at the end of 2019 how Westpac was hit with a $1 billion fine because their financial processes were enabling money laundering, which was aiding the online sexual exploitation of children in the Philippines. And as a result, apart from the fine, they lost a CEO in the process. And so by actually not taking enough action, by not doing enough, there is great reputational risk. So on the one hand, there may be a risk to your business by being transparent, but there's actually a greater risk by not taking action at all. And that could result in undue media attention or unfair media attention. It may impact your investment or customer expectations, it could have a direct financial and legal impact on your business. So companies are being asked to take reasonable steps, and this is and they do this through attending to the criteria of the Modern Slavery Act. One of the tensions that we've found in terms of our engagement with corporates and the research that we do here at Unchained in terms of the corporate response is to have, what we've found is that this idea of reasonable steps at times has been interpreted as perhaps choose your own adventure or not do as much as you possibly could do. There have been a number of reports that have come out over the past couple of years by IJM, by Monash University, by the Human Rights Law Centre, and by us, Unchained, in our partnership with Macquarie University, where we've actually looked at the statements and done research on them to actually see what companies are actually saying about themselves through their own reporting. And there's been some common themes that have come out through the reporting mechanism. One has to do with what I was referring to earlier, that there's been a lack of supplier risk assessment beyond direct suppliers, beyond the data that we can actually receive that we might have through our own procurement or financial systems. There's been a lack of stakeholder engagement for capacity building, particularly with suppliers, to actually work with suppliers constructively and actually see them as partners in the whole process of due diligence. There's been a lack of clear remediation strategy, and I think that results in not actually getting to the actual context of which exploitation occurs, from where actually you'll find out what kind of remedies are actually going to work. And finally, the lack of clear metrics to measure effectiveness, to actually have in place a good structure to determine, based on our place, our role in the ecosystem, what is it that we can actually reasonably do in relation to those that we are connected with, either through our suppliers or our investors, or partnerships that we might have with government or NGOs or other members of civil society. So there's really a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of going deeper and having a much more robust process in place. And unfortunately, apart from a few sectors, there's over the last 12 months in particular, there has been a loosening of the intensity of the urgency around this issue. And as companies have put together their governance frameworks and have put together their risk management frameworks, and in a sense done the first round of those financial steps, have actually stopped or limited in terms of the investment that needs to happen to actually go further and to go deeper to actually do modern slavery due diligence. Just quickly, the other act that is also in play has to do with what's going on in New South Wales. This piece of legislation differs in the sense that it has a commissioner, Dr. James Cockayne, actually driving the legislation. And there are two components here which differ from the federal, whereas the federal is actually addressing large corporations and the private sector at large. The state government legislation is targeting state government procurement and its entities and local governments. So all 128 LGAs in New South Wales will need to comply with the legislation. There's also a bigger emphasis for New South Wales on survivor support services. And so the Commissioner is working with different agents and different civil society groups to actually work out what is the state of play here if someone was to come forward and say that I'm a victim of human trafficking, for example, what services do we actually have in place to actually help that person? And unfortunately, at the moment, the structures are not strong enough to actually help people in the way that they are intended. There's no direct impact on the private sector except for when tendering. So for those organisations that are tendering for business with state government entities and local government, then there's going to be a need for you to step up and actually demonstrate some level of compliance. And this is where the rubber hits the road in terms of the business case for many organisations to actually do the due diligence with the view to actually maintaining a licence to operate. So as we, in terms of the third section and the remaining minutes that we have, let's consider more concretely some of the key steps for industry professionals. some of the foundational steps that you might need to have in your organization and the role that you have and what role you can play is to make sure that, first of all, that you have the right policies and procedures in place. That's a key component of the governance framework, to make sure there are policies and those policies are intelligent and can be communicated and implemented in the organization. They're not just sit on file somewhere. That you develop a solid framework for reporting, and that means actually having, setting the right goals, setting the right KPIs, having an understanding of what I suppose, what are the gaps, what are the enablers within your organization to address modern slavery. Stakeholder education through awareness training and skills training, particularly those at the forefront of supply chain management and working with contractors and logistics personnel. Having risk assessment tools in place to actually have a high level understanding of risk with a view to actually going deeper. The whole organizational governance needs to have the appetite for change. This is a key driver, so that there's actually appropriate sponsorship and the allocation of resources to do the work, and that you also have the right expertise at hand to actually help you do this piece of work. So these are the kind of the foundational priorities. If you haven't done anything, then this is where you should start. The roadmap for change occurs over time, and so here's a very rough time frame, if you like, that you really need to be thinking about addressing modern slavery, not in the next week or the next month, but what you can actually achieve over a period of time. And you might actually need to do this over 3 or 4 reporting periods or financial years, and have the right allocation and cadence to actually do the work and digest the work and make sense of actually the work that you're doing, so that you can actually measure the impact effectively. And finally, yeah, as you from that place of that foundational place is really to discover ways in which you can explore the context of exploitation. That once you've got the policies in place, training in place, a high level understanding of risk in place, that you actually then have a very clear strategy for engagement through with your suppliers, and to get transparency and traceability beyond those direct suppliers, who may in effect really just be a wholesaler or a distributor or a retailer, and that the actual risk itself is going to be far further down the supply chain. And so the challenge there is to actually develop strategies to work with those suppliers, to build capacity with those suppliers to actually drill down to get to the place of workplace exploitation. And this takes a lot of time to actually do this. It's not going to occur over time. One of the benefits of doing that is that in the process, you'll be building more resilient supply chains. There'll be greater sense of transparency and cooperation as companies are working together to explore ways in which to do business and root out human rights violations, and perhaps also other violations to do with the environment. Just to give you an example of some of the work that we've been doing, I work with another firm, Trace SCI, and we've been working with a building consortium of 5 construction firms over the past 12 months to take a deep dive. They had identified 26 suppliers that they were working with in common as Australian suppliers. And then through a process of engagement, we reached out to the suppliers to discover, really to see for them as a pilot, how far we could go for them to actually discern actually what their supply chain actually looked like. And there's some stats there in terms of the processes, in terms of how we actually reached out to those suppliers. So we got 16 out of 26 respondents. 10 out of 16 said that they outsourced the products supplied. 3 out of 16, that's 20%, manufactured those products. Then 2 out of 16 outsourced and manufactured. The 16 out of the 26 respondents declared there were 58 production locations. So as we dug deeper, as we actually worked with those suppliers, we discovered in a sense, the amplification of the supply chain, and that we weren't just dealing with, these companies weren't just dealing with 26 suppliers, but there were many, many locations and many suppliers that they were reaching out to, that they were actually working with. I'm just trying to get to, sorry, yeah. Yeah, and through that process then was to actually look at some of the degrees of separation. Part of that was to look at where there may be concerns around margin bleed, supply chain control, and diminished outcomes and transparency risks. And so that process is still in place, still in progress, as those companies work together to actually, in a sense, map out and unravel where are they buying from, whereabouts, for example, in a jurisdiction those factories are, how many factories, where are those factories located, where are actually the different components of the products being made. All that work takes months of time, and in the process of that is to actually then work out, okay, what is the actual supply chain looking like? Where are we actually losing money in the process? And this actually adds to the business case, and how can we actually, in a sense, root out the human rights issues in the process of actually, in a sense, strengthening, shortening the supply chain, strengthening the supply chain, and working out how we can actually make it more transparent and more resilient, which will benefit the supply chain in the long run. So it's just 5:45, and so I want to just pause there.